Hello everyone, welcome. It's Thursday again, so you're back with me. For those of you that are back with me, for those of you that aren't, shame on you. You shouldn't be doing other fun things, you should be sat in front of your computer. Like Alan in Australia, who is sat with his tea instead of being out on white pristine beaches, which made everyone jealous last week, so there we go. So hello to everyone that is online. For those of you that have been here before, so that's people like Paula and where are we? Jeff, Laura's been online before, Tom, Dan, Alan, Ulrich, Bill, Brian, a few Brians, lots of you, Mark and whatever, welcome back. To those of you that haven't been online before, while we're live, this is an absolutely interactive session. I want it to be interactive, otherwise it gets very boring just talking at you. So please, we're going to spend the next hour going through your images, or the images that some of you guys have sent in. And during that time, we'll edit, if we can, as much as we can. But please, interject, sending questions, sending comments, thoughts. If you think we've done something wrong or weird, then ask away, ask the question. Sometimes we get stuff wrong. that happens, that's fine. But please make it as interactive as you want. Remember, there is about a 5 or 6 second delay between when I do something and you see it on your screens, which means when you comment, it takes about 5 or 6 seconds for it to even show up for me to be able to see. So it's not me ignoring people, that's just the way that streaming works. We're in Capture One, so Capture One being the raw editing program. For those of you that don't know what Capture One is, you're going to be a bit surprised when we go through today, because I'm not sure how you got here. For those of you that do know what it is, make sure you're running on either version 20 or version 21. 21 is absolutely the current version. It's actually 21.1.1. The 0.1.1 is important because there's a lot of bug fixes that happen throughout the life cycle of software. If you don't have Capture One, but after this session think actually it's well worth having a look at, go to capture1.com. You get a free 30-day trial. This isn't affiliate stuff and trying to make money out of links. Just genuinely go and play with it. Go and break it for 30 days if you can. See how it behaves. There's no limitations. There's no restrictions. Just have a look. If you're on 21 and you're not up to date, go to your download section online and download the latest version. If you're on version 12, 11, 10, 9, 8 prior, it's probably worth having a look at what the upgrade price is to get some of the current features which we'll be using today. So let's move into Capture One itself. So there's our interface. For some of you that joined David's session, I think on Tuesday from memory, he talked about customizing the interface, and we're going to just have a little bit of a recap of that quickly. Then we're going to cover something which was requested by, who was it? Alan, I think, Alan Clark. About the Orton Effect, and we'll cover what you can and can't do in Capture One, because there are some limitations in there, but we'll show you what we can get into. And we're going to start with this shot from Jeroen, which is a snowy scene. So just covering and just recapping on the customized stuff that David ran through. Capture One, and actually you'll remember this if you watched it, basically 4 elements to Capture One. The toolbar, completely customizable. Go to Customize Toolbar by right-clicking up here, and you can drag and drop functions to your heart's content. These flexible spaces are kind of handy because they sort of shrink and grow as you're adding tools in. But a lot of people add things like guides up here as a button rather than having to go to the menu. Some people, if you're tethering, some people will have other functions up there as well. But it is useful to have your own set of tools up there in the way that you want to work. The next, obviously, is the viewer, this big thing down here. Just one quick catch-all for everyone. If ever this information here is missing, go to View, go to Customize Viewer, and it's this one, Labels. So every now and then we get questions from people saying, how do I find out the ISO, the aperture, or whatever that the shot was done on? You don't have to, of course you can, but you don't have to go to the Information tab. It is in here. This is your EXIF information from the camera, but it is normally displayed along the bottom of your viewer. If it's not, it's probably because under Customize Viewer, you have labels turned off. Really quick, simple fix. Beyond that, of course, you've got the browser on the right-hand side. I have mine on the right-hand side. You don't have to. So if you go to View, Browser, and you can choose to place it below, puts it along the bottom like a film strip. The browser itself, and again, you'll notice in here, there are the star ratings. So 3-star in this one, and we can do a color rating as well. Some people find that that's missing. Well, one of the reasons it's missing is because they've made the icon size too small. That's all it is. So all you've got to do, if you do find those bits of information missing, number one, check that under Customized Browser, you're not missing the labels, because that's what those are. Number two, make sure you're not zoomed out so that these icons are so small that they can't physically place the labels under each image. So there's a bit of a handy hint. For those of you that don't want the browser on the bottom, again, View, Customize Browser, Place Right, or Shift Command and B moves it or toggles it left to right. And for those of you coming from other editing pieces of software and stuff, sometimes you want the controls on the left. Well, literally on the Customized Tools, Place Right does the switch. So if you prefer that way of working, you can. To a lot of old Capture One users, that feels very foreign. But if you're happy working that way, then there's no reason why the tools have to be on the left. It's just out of the box. That's what it's going to do. So just a quick little recap on that. Remember, you can customize all of these things, and there's loads more you can do with the workspace. We can pull out tools, you can have floating tools and so on. But those are the quick ones. You know, labels disappear for people. The browser can end up with missing information if it's too small. And if you want the tools on the other side, then knock yourself out. Right. Orton Effect. We said we'd pick up on this. So Alan's question, it was Alan from memory now, was, is it possible to achieve the Orton Effect in Capture One? The short answer is no. So that's, we can stop there, I guess. But actually, let's just break down why and what we can do. So Orton Effect, for those of you that aren't familiar, it's there's a photographer called, I'm going to get it wrong, it's Michael Orton, I think. For some reason I thought Matthew Orton, but I'm sure it's Michael Orton. Made an effect very popular because it adds a sort of a painted or watercolory feel to an image. And the way that it was done was actually in developing from the same position, effectively 2 or 3 shots together. So you had obviously your normal standard shot. Then he would produce an overexposed shot that's still sharp. And then he'd produce an out of focus shot that's overexposed as well. And in the darkroom, blend them together, whether it was selectively or across the whole image. And that results in a feel of almost like an etheral sort of feel, a very ghostly feel across some of the highlights, with a lot of smooth stuff going on in clouds and things like that. So a lot of people tried to emulate it, and most people have now managed to do that digitally. So the way digitally that a lot of people will do it is in something like Photoshop or Affinity, or other pixel editors are available. But it's actually a process where you create layers, with one layer being blurred and overexposed, one layer being not blurred, and then there are different layer blending options in pixel editors like screen or soft light or multiply or whatever. And you can then selectively apply that glow to certain areas of the image. Now, we can't do some of that stuff in Capture One. It's not designed to. It's designed to edit a raw image and get the best quality of image out of it. But we're talking single image at a time. But what we can do is some of those elements around making the sort of highlights and things like that slightly more ghostly and painted than others. So we'll run through how you can get to there now. So this shot here, I'm actually going to make some quick adjustments before we even get started, just so that we've got a baseline which is not overexposed, as this shot is slightly. If I go to our exposure warning, we get a bit of a scary reaction up here. If I pull this down, there's not much detail up here. There's not much data. So like we've talked about before, there does come a point where pulling down the exposure isn't going to help you because there's nothing up there anyway. Maybe there's a bit of blue in there, but we are really starting to struggle. So we'll pull the exposure down a touch, and I'm going to pull our highlights down a little bit more, and I'm going to add in some clarity, and I'm just going to shift up the white balance just a little bit, just to be a little more neutral there. So overall, a few little tweaks, and that's probably where I'd go with this picture if we were leaving it natural. But there is our baseline from here. So I'm just going to clone this so that we've got the ability to come back to what we've already done. So cloning, remember, right click and go to clone variant rather than new variant. New variant will go back to the original raw and take no adjustments. Cloning the variant takes that raw with all the adjustments you've done across to another one that you can now play with. So there's our base photo. Let's add a new layer, and I'm going to add a filled adjustment layer. And we're going to call this one, what should we call it? Orton. It's not Orton Effect, it's sort of brief as Orton Effect-ish. Okay, so let's have a little think about what we're going to try and do to simulate that overexposed, slightly blurry look. Well, the first thing is, let's start to overexpose it. I'm not going to use the exposure tab to do this. If I do it with exposure, the risk is we actually push all those things that we pulled back out of the histogram. So instead we're going to use brightness. And brightness, rather than sliding the histogram left and right, it squashes the histogram. So we're going to push more stuff to be bright without pushing it off the end. So there's still no massive exposure warning that would happen if I'd done that amount on exposure. So we now have a brighter image. What about our highlights? Well, actually, we can push our highlights a little bit more. Not too much. Fine. I'm going to reduce our contrast a little bit. Minus 24, it's quite a chunky change, but it's all about starting to mute and soften the image here so we get less differential between the darker areas and the lighter areas. Clarity, minus 100. So we can't blur things in Capture One. Not possible. We don't have a blur tool. It's not a pixel editor. It's not designed to do that. But what we can do is reduce completely the micro contrast that happens between different edges and different textures. And that's what clarity does. So clarity in a positive way will increase contrast, and that looks really nice. Nice and crisp. We've got all of this detail in here. Pretty good. But unfortunately, that's the opposite to what we want in the Orton Effect. What we want, effectively, is none of that. We want to get rid of all of that clarity, rid of all that detail, and we want it to look really soft and almost flat. So minus 100, negative clarity. I'm also going to do the same with structure. So structure is a sharpening tool, and it's looking for textures and very fine details. So again, we're going to knock some of that out. Not all of it, but maybe something like minus 30, minus 40, around there. Haze, be careful with this, because the temptation is then to say, well, okay, well, I'll just dehaze minus 100 as well. Well, number one, if you're going to do that, you've got to choose the right haze color. So choose the right color with this picker here for the shadow tone. So I'm probably going to choose out here. Number two, we've overdone it. It's overcooked. So be careful that you're not adding it. So if we use dehaze strictly, it's going to get rid of all of that foggy stuff. We want to add a little bit more in, but don't overdo it. Now, we now have a shot which is actually pretty overdone, pretty overexposed, pretty flat, well, it's missing all details and everything like that, compared to our baseline, which is this one. So this is our background layer. This is our one with all of those tweaks on it. Now, how to apply that just to the highlights? So what we can do in something like Photoshop is you can add a layer which is either screen or multiply version, which means that Photoshop will only apply the changes to those pixels if certain criteria are met, and we can use it to maybe only attack the highlights or only attack the lowlights or the shadow tones. Well, we've got Luma range. So I can choose our Luma range here and say for this layer, which is a completely filled layer, so let me just turn on the mask, press M on your keyboard. The whole layer is filled, so it's applying everything to everything on the image. I can go to Luma range and say, well, actually, I only want to apply this effect to the very brightest parts. Now, that's all well and good, but now we've got some fall-off problems here because it goes very sharply from that sort of ethereal look and slightly faded look to the sharp, crisp detail in the darker tones. So we're going to stretch out that fall off. So it's a really slow ramp. And remember what this does is it says, for this layer, all of these effects are now going to apply only when a pixel value is between 176, which is this marker here, and 255, this marker here. 255 is the stop dead point. But everywhere from 176, which is pretty bright, all the way down to 40, which is very dark, slowly taper it off. So slowly reduce it, effectively feather that off without a sudden drop-off in that effect. Of course, we can add on radius. We can do a bit of softening on the edges. But for this purpose, I'm just going to hit apply. And now what we've got is there's our original, or our baseline. And there's our effect with a slightly similar-ish to an Orton effect, where we've effectively got a blown out, or not a blown out, but an overexposed or highly exposed area in the highlights, which is softer. It's less detailed. So if I turn this off, we've got all this sharp detail here in this rock. If I turn it on, then that started to fade away. But still, we've kept all this detail down here in the shadows. Now, that's one approach to doing this. But of course, the advantage of a Luma range is we can do the opposite. Because we can actually flip this and say, well, actually, I want to apply it to all the shadows now and not to the highlights. Now, this is going to look pretty horrible. Don't worry. It's meant to, just to show the point. But I can change the way I do things using the Luma range rather than being fixed in terms of some of the layer styles that exist in pixel editors. So that's one way of doing something similar. As I say, it's not possible to get 100% towards that full, Orton effect, watercolory sort of painted effect on some of these scenes. But you can use this method to get close. And the method is really simple. Reduce your contrast, increase your brightness, not exposure. Increase your highlights a little bit, not too much. Clarity, minus 100. Structure, probably about half as much, somewhere minus 30, minus 40. Dehaze a little bit, but don't overdo it. And then use your Luma range to control what is in and what is not in that effect. Now, let's go one further, which is we're talking about the Luma range deciding what's included and what's not. Well, we can actually, in fact, let's go to remove our Luma range. Instead of that, what I can do is I can paint this in. So if I just now right click and go to clear mask, so we end up with a mask, let me just turn it on, M. So a mask that is now gone. All my settings remain, but now I'm going to switch to a brush. Really, really, really soft brush, so hardness at 0. Opacity, actually in this case, it's going to hurt me to say, we're going to do it David's way. We're going to reduce our flow quite low down and a reasonable size brush. And the reason I'm doing that, just so you can understand, is I'm not looking for a consistent amount of application. I'm looking to be able to effectively, very randomly blend this in. But now what I'm going to be doing is painting in that effect into a mask. Now that's going to ruin it with the mask turned on. So let's just undo that, turn my mask off. And now I can paint in that glow all the way along these mountains. So I could even do it down here in the foreground a little bit. So even though these bits wouldn't be included in a Luma range selection, I can choose which bits I want to have that nice soft glow. Just like that. Now my mask is going to look pretty messy, as you can see, but it's getting to where I want it to be. So that's, again, another way of applying that set of changes and adjustments and all the other stuff. So without and with, selectively, once you've dialed the adjustments in. So that's sort of where I get to. So I'm hoping, Alan, that answers your question of, so is it possible to do the complete Orton effect within Capture One? No, it's not. It's also not possible to do it in things like Lightroom either. You'd normally, traditionally have to take it into Photoshop or Affinity or whatever else, into a pixel editor, and apply smart layers to try and effectively copy what the Orton effect was from the darkroom originally. But we can get pretty close to it within Capture One by using that little quick recipe, and either using the Luma range to selectively choose to apply it to the highlights or the shadows, or by painting it in selectively in the areas in your shot that you want it to apply. So hopefully that all makes sense. For those of you that are on, whack in comments or pick up things that are completely wrong in that setup, and we'll talk about it. But hopefully that's the answer that Alan was looking for. It is possible, just there's a couple of tweaks that you need to play with. Regardless of that, without that effect, that's what I'd do to this shot, Jeroen, I think. So if we go before and after, there was our before. There's after very small tweaks. It's just a little white balance neutralization to get rid of this sort of cyany green sort of tone and just bring out some of the detail. And all of that's been done by a reduction in HDR highlights, increasing some clarity, which ironically the next layer then gets rid of. But there we go. Right, so Alan, yeah, there we go. But more importantly, to Alan's point, worth playing around with it. Yes, this is one way of doing it. I've played with those sliders a little bit just to work out a way that works to my eye of getting the effect. As I say, it's not going to get you to 100%. It can probably get you to sort of 80%, but it's very flexible once you've got that layer in there. And talking about flexibility, Jim's point, save it as a style brush and have it any time. Absolutely. So, version 21. Good point, Jim. We'll cover it. So I now have a layer here, which is set to have a reduction in contrast, increase in brightness, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff, great, and a bit of HDR work and all this negative stuff. Be careful with style brushes, remember, that have a shadow tone in. Just be careful with that, but we'll cover that in a second. Now what I can do is I can go up to my style brush here and say save that as a style brush, or I can right click on the layer and save adjustments as a style brush. So let's save it and we'll call it, so first off we're going to choose which bits we want to include. Now in there is going to be our brush settings in terms of size, but also the dehaze amount and the shadow tone. I'm going to disable the shadow tone and just make a mental note of that. So hit save. Let's have a little, let's call it, no, Orton. We'll go with that, Orton Effect. I'm going to load up very quickly then Marcel's image of a jetty. So if we now want to apply that same effect without going through all those steps, in version 21, I can go to my custom brush styles and we'll see it in here, that one, Orton Effect. It's carried across my brush setup here, and I can now paint it in. And it's doing exactly what it did before. The only difference is, and again, remember, my dehaze, I've removed the shadow tone, it's left it as auto. If I now need to correct that haze shadow tone, that's a final step I need to do afterwards. Christian, it is an Orton effect, O-R-T-O-N. It's just, I'm not going to say that we've created it, so we're going to call this one the Orton effect, which is like the fake reefer Orton effect. But yeah, it's Orton, O-R-T-O-N. So there we go in this setup, but I can also, of course, go in with my same brush, and I can now brush into this Pier here to get the same sort of etheral effect over there. That's looking pretty nice. So if I now do my before and after, we go from there to there. But remember, if ever you include dehaze in a style brush, remember that your shadow tone may need adjusting afterwards. But the whole point of style brushes is absolutely that, to Jim's point. Once you've done this once and set it up, it's really easy to then redo it on other images because you just save those settings as a style brush and apply them whenever you're ready. Right, where are we? Couple things then. So, you're playing around, provide many serendipitous and useful results. Absolutely. So, the first thing that I did with this was play around with it yesterday for 5 minutes. Just what do we need to tweak to try and get something that looks similar to the effect that we do elsewhere. But playing around, sometimes you end up with something completely different to what you're expecting, and it's better. Where's next? Mario. Painting's a good idea from the mountains are separated from the foreground, but from the middle of the wood where light is all around the scene. Yeah. So there is a challenge with using a Luma mask, and actually it's the same challenge you'll have in something like Photoshop when you're using it screen mode in the layers palette, which is not every time are things separated by their brightness. So it's very easy to say, well, we'll just apply it to the highlights. Well, what happens if you've got one big highlight in the foreground, then everything else is a highlight, but everything in between is dark? Well, I don't want the effect on this lump as well as everything else out there. So separating it by a Luma range can be a bit of a blunt tool. Painting it in arguably can give you a slightly better effect, but that's up to you. And Barry, yeah, so Michael Orton did it was Michael, sure, there we go. Did this effect with slides that were sandwiched, one out of focus and one overexposed, one stop and so on. Yeah, and blended. And that's exactly what people are now effectively emulating, copying, whatever, within Photoshop and others to try and get the same effect. it's a nice effect. If you've got a sun or a sunrise where you've got a tricky sun flare because the light's been scattered by cloud and stuff like that, sometimes softening up that area and giving it a glow can look really nice. And that's what this delivers. So let's go back then to Marcel's image. So this is a Pier. That's the edit that Marcel sent in, and this is our raw here. So a few changes on the edit. But the question that came in was, how do we get the sea on this side to match the sea on this side? Because this is nice and blue. This bit isn't. It's in part because of the reflections of light as you turn. And at 16 millimeters, this is quite a wide setup. So as the lens sees light from different angles, it's going to reflect against the water differently. So you've got effectively backlit light, so light coming from over here somewhere, or off our shoulder, lighting this up quite nicely, or illuminating that quite nicely, but here it's more in between, so you're getting reflection rather than color. So how do we get color back into here? And I think, Marcel, you'd said that you tried cloning, you tried some stuff with color editor as well, and stuff like that. So I'm going to do this a slightly different way. So let's go. In fact, we're going to start with your image. There's not much else I would change in terms of this edit. Potentially having this bit in the foreground quite so bright is maybe a little bit over the top. If I go to our foreground layer here, you've got this slight increase here in exposure. I'm just going to back that off a little bit, just so I do want some darkness to fall towards the edge of the frame to a certain extent. I'm just going to double check that this is definitely straight along that horizon, because I think it might be a little bit out, but then we've got a weird thing here with this post being unstraight too. So we've got a little bit of keystoning potentially, certainly vertical keystoning, that we might want to just adjust. And then we end up with our our unfortunate weird line. There we go. So from here, I've now got a challenge, which is we've got some color here that we want to put down here. For some reason, you've created this mask, but I can't see any of the changes that have been used. So I can't see anything in curves or color editor, so I'm not sure what this mask is doing. And when I turn the layer off and on, it makes no difference. So you've selected it using the Luma range and a bit of painting by the look of it. But I don't think we need to do that. I don't think we need it. The obvious thing that most people will go to in here that have used Capture One for a while is actually the skin tone tool. So the skin tone tool, it's called the skin tone tool. It's not. It's a uniformity tool. It's designed to make things uniform. So on skin, so effectively my skin tone changes from here across to here. So I'd choose an area on this part of the skin and say, right, make everything that's masked or that's similar the same sort of hue, the same sort of saturation, whatever, to even out effectively skin that's got blemishes and color changes and pigment changes and so on, if that's the look you're going for. But we can also use it for the sky, for example, to even out the blue. We can use it for the sea to make everything look equal. So the ideal world would be skin tone tool. I'm going to choose a midpoint, maybe along here. That's in this blue area. And I'm going to say, actually, everything left and right along here. Soften out that smoothness. The smoothness determines, just like a Luma range, how softly the fall off happens from our desired color. The top box in the skin tone tool decides what color we're aiming for. So if I wanted to change that blue color a little bit, which I don't, but I might want to increase some saturation, I might want to increase some lightness or decrease it and so on. And this here is only going to apply to the area that is masked, remember, on this sea layer. So because of that, I'm actually going to clear this and manually paint in with a soft brush, 100%, 100%, and just paint in everything here that I might want to include in this sea layer. Okay. Where was Paula's? No, I just saw Paula's just made a point there. He's a custom. Sorry, that was Tom. It'd be so nice to have some sort of breakdown of edits when you select a layer. Yes, so especially with style brushes coming along, it it would be good to be able to see almost a hover over here that says this is everything that's happened on that layer. I agree. It's not there yet, but yes, I would like that too, especially when I'm trying to work out what people have done. So we now have a layer which is everything that's covered in red here on this mask. Remember, there's still a Luma range applied, which has taken this out of it, so I'm going to remove that Luma range. For some reason, we've got something odd going on up there, which I wasn't expecting. I thought that was the Luma range, but it's not. So it may be an auto mask element, because for some reason auto mask has ended up automatically on. Don't want that. Why has it stayed on? That's weird. So with auto mask turned off, let's just try and neaten that up a little bit. And the positive is auto mask got rid of the horizon issue, but I don't want it for right now. So there is our area that I do want to include in the skin tone uniformity. And I can now say, right, well, let's make the color or the hue the same across this whole thing. Let's make the saturation the same. And let's make the lightness roughly the same. Not completely the same. It's going to flatten everything too much, but a little bit the same. Okay. So it's tried to make the sea more uniform. So it's tried to take this mid color here and make this stuff on the left more like it, this stuff on the right more like it. And if I turn this off and on, we can see, yeah, it has made this stuff over here more blue, but it's also affected the left. It's not really that, I guess, natural. It's gone a bit too much. But more importantly, it hasn't really changed this significantly on the right. It's changed the left more than the right. And in part, because if I go onto our advanced tool here and click on this area here, look at the color it's in. So even though our eyes have been trained to think that this is green and blue and whatever because it's the sea, actually the color would disagree with you. So as I go around the color picker, we can see that this bit here, yeah, is on that curve and it's going to be picked up by that arc. This bit definitely will. But all this stuff here, it's on the other side of the color wheel. So everything I'm doing in the skin tone tool, completely pointless, because I'm making uniform anything that's in this cone, not anything over here. The only way of doing it effectively would be to wrap this all the way around. And now, yeah, I get something that's more, I guess, more uniform, of course. But I'm going to have to draw such a clever mask because it's going to affect everything, like this pontoon stuff out here. And I don't need to do that with this shot. That's the funny thing with this. So let's just completely reset our color editor back to nothing. And I've got my mask here. Well, I'm going to remove this mask. Let's just clear it completely. With my brush tool, I'm going to put my opacity down a little bit. And a pretty soft brush. And let's go on to our standard, so the histogram tab. That's our sort of home base for most edits or edits in Capture One. And with this layer here, I'm going to just reduce the Kelvin, the color balance or the white balance, and the tint down a little bit, and start painting in. Now I'm going to turn the mask off so I don't see red, so that I see the actual effect of it. But all I'm doing here is painting in a layer, one layer at a time, so one 25% of a time at each go. And we're just going to softly feather that across here. So I'm going to have more of it applied to the right of the image, less of it applied over here. So all we're doing is changing our white balance of this right-hand side. And I can do it more to there. And now I have blue all around. So it is that easy in this case. So yes, the temptation is to go straight to color editor to start trying to play with things because our head says, right, it's the sea. Let's try and make all of the sea blue or green or that same sort of tone. The trick is that actually what we were trying to change wasn't blue in the first place. It was already on the other side of the color wheel. And as I go to the other side of the color wheel, unfortunately, this is now blue, funnily enough. But unfortunately, when it was the other side of it, so let's turn that layer off and pick. We are now, we are now over on this side of it. anything I do to make the blues and greens more uniform is never going to affect this part of the image because it was never in the blue or the green section of that color editor. So instead of color editor, reset all of that, get rid of that. And instead we create a new C layer, which has got a very, very, very soft edged mask. And with that layer, we're just going to change the white balance. Don't need to change the colors, just change the white balance. And if that's too much, if this is now too blue, looks a bit overdone, that's what the opacity slider's for on this layer. So we can pull it down to where it was before, pull it up to 100%, or we can probably end up naturally somewhere around about the middle. That sort of works. Mark, that's just solved many problems. Hopefully, that's the plan of these sessions. Honestly, on this stuff, just sometimes just think about if the tool you're trying to use isn't working, especially in skies and seas and stuff like that. So you're choosing a color and trying to make it more blue or more green. Well, to be more blue and more green, it's got to be blue or green to start with, at least on that side of the wheel. And if it's not, anything you do in that color editor isn't going to make much of a difference without overdoing it, and then it's going to look unnatural. So consider white balance instead of color editor, especially when it comes to skies and seas. Yeah, and so Paul, a dramatic sea style brush. Maybe. We could actually, if we really want to go for it, I don't need a new layer. Let's just go to our style brushes. Let's have a look at our dramatic sky, or deep sky, sorry. Nice big brush. And let's just apply it down here. Maybe, I think it's probably a bit over the top. It's probably overdone. But, you know, yeah, maybe there's a style brush to play with on the sea. Where was the question? I just saw one, sorry. Anthony, what is the dot in the color editor within the pie slice selected? Okay, so let's go to the color editor. Let's create just a random new layer. I'm going to choose now with the picker and say click there. Okay. If I reduce our smoothness to 0, you see this pie becomes or the slice of the pie becomes very, very sharp. What that means is in this color editor, anything to the left and right of this line is absolutely removed. So it falls off a cliff. So effectively, if it's not within that hue range, it's not included. By increasing the smoothness, it's a bit like feathering. Effectively, you get this sort of that slice and a bit more. Okay. The next part of, or the dynamic of this, that dot is exactly where I picked. The problem is with color, if I pick an exact dot and start changing it, you're going to see literally 1 pixel change because the pixels to the left and right of it might be slightly different, more saturation, or different hue, different values, different lightness, and so on. So what we've effectively got to think about is allowing for a cluster of a color. So that's why the dot is there. That tells me what I clicked on. So I clicked on there, or let's go for this green here, or even this gray. Let's go to the other side. That's giving me where I clicked. The wedge is the area around where I clicked that we're going to affect. And it's done for safety more than anything. As I get nearer into the middle of the circle, less saturated. As I get further out towards the rest of the circle, more saturated. So this would be everything that's heavy blue through to everything that's really, really light blue to the point where it's almost white. And then as I make it wider along here, that's going to change the hue values. So now it's including some purples, some cyans, almost up to including some greens. Now everything from green to purple is included, from 100% saturation to 0% saturation, but it's still telling me where I actually clicked to start with. If I really wanted a really, really, really accurate wedge, I'd have to pull this in like that. Whoops. And in fact, we have to do this a little carefully. So we pull that all the way down here to the dot, pull this all the way in there, and pull this middle part all the way out. Now, and if I turn that smoothness off, it's very rare you're going to see something like this, but that as a color editor will affect literally the color pixel that I chose, so that particular dot. And if that color happens to apply somewhere else in the shot, it's going to affect that too. But you're going to see some really weird results, which is why the default for Capture One is to give you a bit of breathing space either side. Hopefully that made sense. Where are we? Tibby actually answered the question earlier, which is, yeah, it's the selected color from the picker. But there's a reason that the dot doesn't match the wedge, and it's to make things look better. Jeff, I'm curious if you've had a play with these images before the live session or know which way to go. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So I will tell you now, funnily enough, the Orton Effect-ish. I tried out actually on this shot of Marcel's first. Went in and loaded up Jeroen's shot just before we went live and realised actually this might be a better one to demonstrate it with. There are some shots that I haven't played with at all, including the one that we're going to come up with in a minute for Claudiu. But yeah, sometimes we'll have a little play in terms of, most importantly actually, understanding what the person that sent it in has tried to do and what they haven't done, and where we can try and help. So hence in this one I knew that in Marcel's image he had a C layer, and I knew that it was based on a Luma range and it wasn't using white balance, which is why we couldn't get to that blue. Yeah, Derek's just made a very, very good point, and absolutely spot on with this. It's why actually I backed away the opacity on this layer. Be really careful, and we've talked about this on many sessions before, especially with anything with the reflection in, because it's obvious. That's one thing to be clear on. But the sea is reflecting the quality and the color and the brightness and the hue of light that's coming from the sky or from the sun. If we change this too much, so let's maybe let's warm that up a little bit and make it nice and rosy. This doesn't make sense. How could this be the reflection of that sky up there? So you are always entirely able to edit to your heart's content, but just keep an eye and try and keep to a certain extent in sync with the source of light and the result of light so that they don't get too far apart. If they're too far apart, it's pretty obvious it's been warped over the top. Right, Claudiu's image. We've got two shots from Claudiu. I'm going to start with this one. We may pick up on the other shot in another session, but this shot from London, I know exactly where you were stood when you shot this. And actually, so again, on to answer Jeff's point previously, I haven't played with this yet. I can see a couple things that I will probably do, and we'll talk through those. But one thing that is standing out, which sort of bugs me a little bit, and I don't know why it's there, but it's above the moon. Let me just show you. So let's just zoom in. This here, these little lines across it, I'm hoping this comes out on the stream. These lines are obviously little wisps of cloud or something in the air. Happens normally. Nice red moon, by the way. But it's picked up these lines, and that's going to reflect some of that light for sure. But what I don't understand is this sort of tail. Almost like the moon's being dropped into it's like an Alka-Seltzer ad, but with a moon. So I'm not too happy with that. It may be completely natural. It probably is completely natural. This is the raw file. So I'm not disputing that was what the camera saw. But it feels uncomfortable to look at. I just don't get that little drop thing. So we'll try and fix that. There are a couple things on here to consider while not necessarily fixing. So, unfortunately, Tower Bridge has often had these gaps in its lights along the rails. It's almost, you can actually date a picture of Tower Bridge based on which of the lights was out the time that you shot it. Some of them are natural, they're just breaks in the lighting setup. Some of them are where the bulbs have gone. You have a choice. You can try and clone these. In fact, it's going to be very difficult to clone this in Capture One, but you can try and do it. Generally on this stuff, leave it as it is. The city was designed to be captured on that point in time and that day. If that day you had a couple of these things broken, that's part of it. That's part of shooting the city. Claudiu's online. So moon popped up behind the clouds for 10 minutes. Maybe it's the cause. Maybe it's just vapor in the air or something like that. I mean, it's a where are we? 1.6 second shot, so it's not physically movement. It's nothing like that. Barry's saying maybe a double exposure in the camera. I'm not so sure because there's no shape to it. It's as I say, it's odd. This is weird. However, it happened, so we've got some debate to do over what we're going to do with it. But let's start with the base image properties first. So I'm going to go into our lens tab. We don't have the lens that Claudiu was using loaded in. It hasn't sent in across any manufacturer profile information, so that's fine. We're going to leave it as generic. I am going to tick chromatic aberration because, especially if we're using a generic profile, it's not going to do any of that stuff. Ticking that box is going to force Capture One to analyze the whole image, look for any aberration and try and correct it. Diffraction at this aperture shouldn't be an issue. And I'm just going to go back into this bridge and have a look at what we can recover with highlights and whites. So we go into our exposure tab. For this, just so that we can always revert, I'm going to create a new filled adjustment layer and do all of our adjustments on here. So base adjustments. So let's see what we can do. Let's pull back our white, pull back our highlights, and do we get much back on the tower? We get a little bit back. Obviously, the bits that are completely overexposed, of course, will always be overexposed. So we're never going to get them back completely, but I'm looking at things like this building here, which is a bit hot. You know, we can get things like, and I'm zooming in really unfairly here, don't worry, but you see this window frame here. Well, we didn't have it so clearly before, so even though it's not having a huge effect, the effect it is having is positive, so I'll leave that on. So highlights and whites, pull them all the way back. We're going to push up shadows, not black. So if I push up the black channel, or the black tones in here, what we're going to end up with is a very flattened image. You can see it starts to look, you know, we use the phrase quite a lot, but it starts to look cartoony. We don't want to do that because what that's doing is effectively just pushing up the darkest 5% of our histogram into the lower midtones instead. It's much more natural to pull up all of the shadows together. And then if that doesn't pull up enough, then you use a tiny bit of black pull just to bring up that very bottom part of the underexposed histogram only. But this now looks much more natural than just trying to pull up that black slider and try and make everything flattened. I am going to apply quite a bit of clarity, probably more than I normally would, but that's because I want to get the structures in here really, really popping. So if I do hold down the Option key or the Alt key on your keyboard and press on the reset button while holding it down, you can temporarily reset any tool. So that's before, that's after. So you see that sort of pop that we get as a result of that clarity boost. Maybe we want to use a little bit of structure, not too much, but just to bring out some of the sharpness in here, especially when it was shot at night. There's no haze to worry about, so we're not going to worry about trying to do anything with dehaze. Where are we? Question. Prasad, how about using a linear response curve to recover details from the blown highlight? Yes, in some cases. In this case, I fear, we'll do it, that in using linear response, you're not actually going to recover the highlight. When we have a very, very stretched histogram, so in other words, really, really, really high peaks in the highlights and high peaks in the shadows, linear response has the effect of, well, sorry, let me correct that. The auto curve, which is basically film standard, has an S curve built into it. So if something's already bright in the highlights, it's going to brighten it more. If something's already dark in the shadows, it's going to darken it more. So if you've got that sort of U-shaped histogram, the auto curve is going to push it even more contrast. It's going to push some of those things to be overexposed. In this case here, we do have a bit of a U-curve, but most of these highlights are actually already off the end of that histogram. So linear response won't apply that S curve to it, but it's not actually going to recover much either because the stuff that it's able to pull back is already outside of the 255. Tom's just said, painting in the mask, this is the step I keep missing when I use the skin uniformity tool to edit colors. Yeah. So when you're remember, the mask and the color editor are two separate things. It's why you can create a mask from a color range. It's why the color editor has that function where we can go onto whatever we've chosen and say create a masked layer from selection. The mask and color editor are independent, but they can link together. So the color editor is editing the colors, and this applies to the skin tone tool too, that are within the area you have masked. So just don't forget you kind of need both to apply. Rudy's just said, how about the noise in low light? In this case here, honestly, it's ISO 200. It's pretty clean. I'm not too worried about the noise level in here. I mean, here we are at 100% on your screen. I'm not seeing much that's an issue. If we were, let's just remember as well, when you're editing for noise, always do it at 100%, never further out. Go to your background layer, which is where most of the noise reduction is. You could put a touch more noise reduction on there if you wanted to, but at the risk of losing some detail. So don't push it too far. Maybe a bit more would help, but this is pretty clean so far. Okay, so that's our sort of light levels sorted. So we've got as much of the highlights back as we possibly could, as much of the shadows lifted where they still look reasonable. Now we're going to start playing with white balance. You've got to be careful with this because, believe it or not, Tower Bridge from this angle can look quite green, which is how it's coming across at the moment. So trying to find a neutral part of the image is actually very, very difficult. This ship here should be, in theory, Battleship Grey. So let's try and click it. Yep, and you'll see actually the image gets even greener. So this is one where I want to be really careful. There's a differentiation between what's absolutely accurate for this white balance at this moment in time, on this night, and what looks pleasing. And in this case, it just feels a bit too green. So I'm actually going to cool down the image and shift that green. Not that cool, but shift the green away from the green using the tint, just to get this feeling more neutral. So even though it may not be literal grey, as I move my mouse over here, it's going to give me these numbers at the top. Oh no, it's not, because I got rid of that. Sorry about that. You guys haven't been able to see the RGB numbers. So as I move my cursor around, you will see that we've got the numbers along here, and if they all match, then it's grey, or it's on the grey scale. If one number is slightly more than the other, so you can see in this case, it's slightly green, slightly more blue than red. So there's a shift of the colour, but to my eyes, it just feels a bit more neutral than what it was before. This just feels a bit more muddy, a bit murkier. This just feels a bit more crisp. So that's the reason I've done it. It doesn't mean that it was wrong in the first place. It's just it feels better to my eye. If we try and straighten this now remember that bridges, like Tower Bridge, aren't actually straight. They have a slight hump. So if we try and do that, that's actually going to work in this case. If it didn't, then it might have been worth looking at the keystone tool instead. But now we're in a much straighter position. Great. I might then change this to be a 2:3 aspect ratio. The reason being, nothing down here is helping me. So this is taken on an Olympus, which is at 4/3. This here gives me probably a more full shot, let's call it that, without some of the stuff down the bottom to worry about because it's not adding anything to the frame. Then let's look at this moon. So here we go, Jeff, to your point. My worry is that we might get this wrong, but it doesn't matter. We're all on there. So let's create a new empty layer. In fact, we're not going to do that. I'm going to create a new clone layer. And we're going to call it moon. We're not going to use the heal brush. The reason we're not is because the healing brush is going to try and blend everything in. And I'll show you actually why. So let's create a new healing layer. So the Band-Aid tool up the top. Make sure this is set to 100% opacity. Nice and smooth, a little smaller than that. And let's choose. So hold down the Option key. If you don't choose it manually, Capture One's going to guess for you. In this case, I'm going to say, I want this sky. And I want to paint it over here. That's done an okay job of that, I guess. But look at what happens. I've gone over the moon intentionally, to be fair. But it's tried to blend. So you can see here, even though this layer has got rid of this distinctive area here, what it's done is it's effectively spread it out because the healing brush is designed to take what's around it and smooth in from its origin content into what was there on the destination. I don't want it smoothed in. I want it completely replaced, which is what the clone tool's for. So just because we have a heal tool doesn't mean the clone tool is now irrelevant. I'm going to set the opacity quite low on this one. I'll show you why. And size relatively big. And I'm going to, again, choose my source, Option key or Alt key. Click there, choose my destination, and start painting. And I'm going to go over the moon. There's a quote. But it doesn't matter. I'm just painting, painting, painting until we've got rid of all of that orange. Now I've gone too far, so let's go to my eraser. Bit bigger here, 100% opacity, and erase that part of the clone. So it's done an okay job. I'm going to go back to my clone tool again and choose another bit from here and just clone across there just to smooth that in. But what about the moon? Well, it's not done a great job there, has it? Because I've gone over it. I've got two choices. I can try and create a very, very, very accurate mask. In fact, no, what am I saying? We've only got one choice because we can't... Interesting fact. We can't apply a Luma range to a clone layer. So my trick was going to be, we'll do all that and then we'll apply the Luma range and remove the moon from it using that range. Proof that we do stuff live, just realised we can't do that. So instead, mask, go to our brush tool, make it quite a hard edge, not completely 100%. Pull down our size down to there. And, oops, sorry. Sorry, my eraser, better. Pull down our size, and we're just going to erase our clone out of here so we don't affect that moon. But you'll see this is a much cleaner result than trying to use the healing brush. This is where we've got to get really, really, really picky to make this natural. So I wish we didn't have that little weird egg drop thing that had happened on this shot, but we do. So we'll use this to fix it. Now I've actually got auto mask enabled on here, which means as I go over the edges, Capture One is quite handily neatening them up. If I want to do it completely manually, just take the auto mask off of the brush setting on the layer. So if I go to my brush setting, we've got auto mask on. That's also applying to the eraser on the layer. So back to my eraser and just finish that. Let's turn off our mask. Come zoom out. There we go. That looks quite clean. So we go from there with our drop to there, nice and neat and clean, a lot better. So yeah, and Claudiu's just mentioned, so to give you some context, the moon is surrounded by clouds. So I can't explain what it is, but I know that it's not an error. it's what the camera saw. I've just never seen it do that before in that sort of drop. And this is why I'm saying it's your choice as to whether to get rid of it or not. If you do though, don't use the healing brush. Use the clone tool and erase out the rest of that moon. Right. So let's carry on. So from here, again, we've got another thing here. So this is interesting. This is just the reflection of the fact that we don't have any lights here. But it's quite distracting in the shot. So in this shot here, I'm just going to, again, use my clone tool. But we're not going to use the moon layer. We're going to create a new clone layer and call it water reflection. I know it's a clone layer because of this little icon here on the side. So water reflection there. And I'm just going to paint that in. Now, if I think that that's going to look a bit too fake, let's call it that, we can back off our opacity. So I'm going to come in at probably about there just to take the edge off of it. So I don't think that it's a dust spot or something on the lens. So it's nice and clean. Then, actually, this is a weird one to do it on, but I am going to create a new empty layer with a radial mask around our ship. Nice and soft, so pull that radial mask into there, and with that mask set, I'm going to go back to my base adjustments and lift up brightness for the image, and onto my, let's call this radial mask, onto our radial mask. Now just pull down that exposure a touch. So exposure is allowing me to actually underexpose the black elements of the image as well. And that's it. That's probably where I'd end up with this one, Claudiu. So let's just go before and after. So we go from there, a little bit murky, a little bit muddy, a little bit flat, to here. It's much more poppy. We've tidied up the moon. It's your choice whether you want to leave the moon tidied up. That's your call. But that's probably where I'd leave this rather than in that place to begin with. Okay, so that's it, I think, for today. That's our lot for today. Hopefully you guys have got what you wanted out of that session. So we've got this one here quickly with a moon fix. Marcel's jetty, which has got the evening out of the water from the left to the right hand side, not using the color editor. Use the white balance tool in that case. And Jeroen's snow shop, but also where we've got an Orton-ish effect that you can use in Capture One. Remember, for those of you that want to copy it, these are the rough settings you want to be aiming to use. Once you've done that, you can always right-click, save it as a style brush, and then paint it in, as we did on there, to your heart's content. Between now and next week, so we'll see you next week, for those of you that want to join again. It'll be, again, Thursday, 3 o'clock UK time, so whatever time that is where you are. In the meantime, join in on that Facebook group. That's where, for instance, Alan asked, how do we do the, the Orton thing, so that's what happened. So join in on there, everyone's welcome. And we've got also those 20-minute YouTube sessions, which are covering each individual tool. So things like masks and ranges and brightness tools versus exposure and so on. Between now and next week, if you want your image to be on the screen and played with, then go to paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com, upload your image. You have to agree that we can edit it, obviously, but also include your name so I know who is sending in the image and who we're talking about. And then hopefully we'll try and get you on either next time or time after, and so on as we're working through. But between now and then, stay looking after yourselves all around the world, hopefully, and we'll catch you in a week's time. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.